In the factoring lesson, we learned how to factor these. So if you need a little review on that, you can go back to the first factoring lesson. But here, if I were to factor this, I would get, hold on, I would get x minus 4 squared. Now you might be wondering how I got from here to here. And I took the square, because I know that this is a perfect square trinomial. And the reason I know is if I take the square root of this term, I get x. If I take the square root of this term, I get 4. If I multiply these two and double, so multiply and double, I get 8x, which is what I have in for my middle term, regardless of whether it's a plus or minus. So first of all, that's how I know it's a perfect square trinomial, because the square root of this one and the square root of this one, when I multiply them and double, I get this. And then factoring is even easier because I'm just doing the square root of the first term, and I write it here, the square root of the last term, and I write it here, and then the sign of the middle term goes here. So what we're going to do down below, you'll notice that these trinomials are missing their constant term. So they have no last term. But using this pattern, we're going to figure it out. So if we look at this perfect square trinomial, the one that we've already kind of dissected and factored, if I were to take this middle term and I divide it by 2, then I get this number, right? But if I were to take this middle term, divide it by 2, and then square it, I get this number. And this only happens with perfect square trinomials where it's x squared out in front. Notice that none of these have a number coefficient, right? There's no coefficient for any of these x squareds besides 1. These are all 1x squared. So when you have 1x squared, then the pattern will follow that if you take the middle term, cut it in half, and then square it, you get the last term. So let's do that. For this first one, if I take my middle term, and even if it's a negative, for this the signs don't matter so much because I'm squaring, but let's just keep consistency intact. So if I take that negative 12 and I divide it by 2, I get negative 6. Negative 6 squared is 36. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to do that for all the rest of them here. So let's look at the one right underneath that. If I take 2 and I divide it by 2, so I'm taking half of it, I get 1. If I square that, I get 1. All right, 10, or negative 10, should I say, divided by 2 is negative 5. Square that, and I get a positive 25. Should have written a plus there. Let's keep going. Oh, this one's already done for us. It's the same as the one we started with, so I know this one's plus 16. So for this next one, it's 14 divided by 2 gives me 7. Squared will give me 49. And then 6 divided by 2. And then I'm going to square that 3, and I get 9. So notice that they're all positive, because whether I'm squaring a negative or I'm squaring a positive, it's going to turn out to be positive. All right, so now we're going to use this method of finding that third term in completing the square, because that's going to become very important. All right, so let's do it. So for this first one, I need to get it to where it looks like what I had on the previous screen, where I have just the x terms by themselves on the right side. So the first task at hand is to get this over to the other side. And to do that, I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. So on the left, I can't combine these like terms. I just leave it y minus 8. On the right, I have x squared minus 6x. Now, we're going to do the same thing we did on the previous screen, and we're going to fill in what should go here. So I remember from before, I take my middle term, right? My middle term is -6. I'll do it off over here off to the side. I'm going to do -6 divided by 2, and I get 3. And then I'm going to square that, so I'm going to add 9. But we know in algebra, the golden rule says you can't just add something to one side. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So that means I also have to add 9 to the left side. So now on the left side, I can combine like terms, and I get y plus 1, because -8 plus 9 is 1. On the on the right side, I have my perfect square trinomial. Now I can take this perfect square trinomial and I can write it as a binomial to the second power. I would take the square root of the first term and get x, take the square root of the last term and get 3, take the sign of the middle term and it's a minus sign. The last thing I would need to do is if I wanted to have it in y equals and have it in true general form, now I need to take this plus 1 and move it back over to the right side. So I would have my squared binomial, and then in order to move it over, I've got to subtract 1 from both sides. And that would be the general form for the quadratic. All right, let's try another one. So in this next one, I'm going to start the same way. I'm going to have this term that needs to move over, right, to the other side so I can get my x's alone. So to do that, I'm going to subtract 16 from both sides. On the left, I'll have y minus 16. On the right, I'll have just my x terms. Now, you might be ready to look for that third term right here, but remember what we talked about. This has to be a 1. I can't have a number in front of my x squared if I'm going to start completing the square. So I have to factor, or I have to divide by 3 on the right side. And when I do that, I'm just going to keep the 3 out in front, and I have to factor it out of both terms. So here I'll get x squared, and here I'll just have 4x. Now this is different from when we factored out the greatest common factor, because notice I left the x's in there. I could have taken out a 3x from each of these, right? But I didn't do that because I want to be left with the x squared and the 4x, because I'm going to fill in that third term to complete the square. All right, so we have y minus 16 equals 3, and x squared plus 4x, and then plus something, right? This is where I have to figure out how to fill in that third term. So I take my middle term, I take half of it, half of 4 is 2, and then I square it. 2 times itself is 4. Now be careful, because you may be tempted that since you write plus 4 over here, you want to write plus 4 over here, because you have to do the same thing to both sides, right? But think about what you're actually adding on the right side. Yes, it's a plus 4 in here, but there's a times 3 on the outside. So this 4 that we wrote in here is being multiplied by 3. So it's actually like we added 12, because 3 times 4 is 12. So we have to add 12 on the other side. On the left, we will get y minus 4, because that's what we get when we combine these like terms. On the right, we'll have 3, and then we can write our binomial squared. We take the square root of the first term, square root of the last term, sign of the middle term. And the last step is we want y alone, so we got to move this back over. To do that, we add 4 to both sides. So we end up with y equals 3, the quantity x plus 2 squared plus 4. And that's our general form.